the 13th, beginning with the 13th chapter of Acts, there is a division in the book. Before that point, Peter has been primarily the subject of the book, Peter and John. And now, beginning with the 13th chapter, it is Paul. It will be Paul from now on. It is, as I have said often before, I think that we should think of the Jewish church as beginning from Jerusalem, and the Gentile church developing from Antioch in Syria. Now let me say just a word about Antioch. There are two different Antiochs in the Bible. The Antioch where Paul goes in the 13th chapter of Acts, the subject of the church of Antioch there, is not the same as when Paul addresses the synagogue in Antioch. There was a king, a Greek king named Antiochus, and he built a lot of cities, several cities. In fact, besides just those two, Antioch in Syria and Antioch near Pisidia. And so I'll make the distinction between them that way. I'll try to associate the big Antioch, which was the third largest city of the empire. I'll try to identify it as Antioch of Syria, and the smaller Antioch in the Galatian province, the province of Galatia. In the western side of that province, I'll call Antioch of Pisidia. And so there are two different Antiochs that we're talking about as we go along. The 13th chapter begins by saying there was at Antioch in the church prophets and teachers, and then it mentions a few of them. The first that it mentions is Barnabas. Now we're already familiar with Barnabas back in the 4th chapter of Acts. He was a Levite, meaning he was from the priestly tribe. He was a Levite from the island of Cyprus. He owned a property on Cyprus and sold the property and laid the money that he got for it at the feet of the apostles in Acts the 4th chapter. The word means son of exhortation, and while there are about 4 names that he has, Barnabas is what he is most often called in the Bible. So the first person to be mentioned, which probably says he had a certain priority with the apostles and prophets, was Barnabas. After him, Simeon, who is called Niger. Now the word Niger in Latin means black. And so Simeon, do you remember there was a Simeon who bore the cross of Jesus? He had 2 sons, Rufus, and I've forgotten the name of the other one. But Rufus is mentioned in the 16th chapter of the book of Romans. He apparently was well known in the church of Rome. And he is from Cyrene, which is the province, the Roman province, just west of Egypt. And so he may well have been dark-complected. And then it goes on to say Lucius was also there. Now, that apparently is the Luke that we know of who wrote the Gospel and the book of Acts. Though it's not clear, it's a fairly common name. So we have Lucius of Cyrene. He is also from that area west of Egypt. And then after him is Manaen, who it says was brought up with a fellow, the Greek says that he was a fellow partaker of the food. He was a companion of Herod the Tetrarch, apparently meaning Herod Antipas, grew up with him. He may or may not have been an important person in the government of that part of the world. But among the last person who is named in the list is Saul of Tarsus. At this point he is called Saul all the time. And the Holy Spirit tells the church to separate out the first name of this list, Barnabas, and the last one, Saul, and that they are to be representatives. They're to go into the world, into the Greek-speaking world, with the message of Christ. And this is the first time that there are ambassadors that are sent out, that apostles go out, sent by a church, sent by the church at Antioch in Syria, to the Gentile world. not primarily to the Jews, although Paul says that he was an apostle to the Gentiles, while Peter was an apostle to the Jews in the book of Galatians in chapter 2. While he says that, Paul clearly preached at times to Jews, and Peter at times preached to Gentiles. But the two of them, Paul, or Saul as he is called, and Barnabas, take leave of the church at Antioch, travel down to the coast to a city named Seleucia, take a boat across, it's a fairly short boat ride, across from Seleucia on the mainland of Asia, across to the island of Cyprus. They're in Cyprus, well, it doesn't say just how long, but there are two cities that are mentioned. One is Seleucia, and it was there that they stopped first. Apparently did not stay long. Traveled across the island. What they did along the way, did they find any synagogues? Did they preach of Christ along the route? Well, the Bible simply doesn't say. But when they reached the western part of the island of Cyprus, they came to the city of Paphos. That's where the Roman proconsul had his seat. There are just two proconsuls mentioned in the Bible. A proconsul was a very important person in the Roman world. And this proconsul is in charge of the island of Cyprus and possibly Cyrene, the province just to the north on the coast of Turkey. The other proconsul who's named is I can't think of his name, Apollos. He is in the 18th chapter of Acts. Gallio. And so Gallio is also a proconsul. Gallio, incidentally, was a brother to Seneca, and Seneca was for a while virtually ran the empire during the reign of Nero. And so Paul and Barnabas come across this proconsul by the name of Paulus. There was an important Roman family named Paulus that had a great deal of influence in the empire. This may be a part of that family, the Paulus family, who met Paul and Barnabas there. And then in the book of Acts, for some reason, it says Saul, who is also called Paul. And from that point onward, he is Paul. It is Paul and company. Paul establishes his leadership in the missionaries that went first to Paphos. Now they were accompanied in the early part of the trip. Paul and Barnabas were accompanied by John Mark, a young man who apparently was sort of an aide to them. That is, he gathered the firewood and did whatever menial chores that needed to be done. But for some reason, in between, while Paul and Barnabas are traveling over into the mainland of Turkey, John Mark leaves them and goes back to the city of Jerusalem, where his parents were, where his home was. And so that's the last we will hear in the book of Acts about John Mark. And so Paul and Barnabas embark on the continent or the subcontinent of Turkey. We call it Asia Minor today, but in the ancient world, Asia was a province of Rome that was on to the west. Well, the two of them, apparently, they did not stay long along the coast, but set out immediately for the heartland, where there would be Gentiles that they would need to preach the gospel to. Now, the travel that it appears that the two of them made as they went they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them, it says. But going on from Perga, they arrived at Pisidian Antioch. Now, that sounds like a short distance, but it wasn't. It was a long travel, and most of it uphill. Turkey has a high plateau that the country is made up mostly of. And so Paul and Barnabas traveled a long distance, largely uphill, on their way to Antioch of Pisidia. Now the King James says Antioch in Pisidia, but there is a preposition there that it doesn't clearly mean in. It may mean near or something like that. Antioch that was near Pisidia. Why is that important? Well, this Antioch was one of the Galatian churches that Paul wrote the letter of Galatians to. It is my opinion, not just mine, other people's as well, that that the Galatian churches, that the book of Galatians, the letter of Galatians is addressed to, are the same churches that Paul and Barnabas established in the first missionary journey. That is Antioch, Pisidia, Iconium, Derbe, Lystra, the cities where Paul and Barnabas preached. Well, it was here in Antioch of Pisidia, Antioch near Pisidia. It was near. Pisidia is the name of an area, not of a city, not of a province, but sort of an area, an unofficial name for the people who lived in that part of the world. I've always thought of it like in Searcy, there is a Cloverdale. Well, Cloverdale is never going to come up on a map. Cloverdale is a part of Searcy, and it'll be, or we might talk about River Oaks or something like that. It was an area of the city. And so Pisidia was an area that was adjacent to the Roman province of Galatia. Paul and Barnabas went into the synagogue that was there. Now, it is helpful to us if we know something about what the makeup of a synagogue was. Of course, it had the makeup of the Jewish community in that part of the world or in that city. But in addition, it would also have the pious Greeks. A number of Greeks would go to the synagogues simply because they had a conception of God. The Jews had a conception of God that many of the Gentiles highly respected. That is, it was not just the paganism or the polytheism that the Greeks normally met in their life. But when they would come to that city or to that place, to the synagogue, they would find a conception of God that they liked better. Paul began his sermon there by talking some about the history of the people of Israel. The sermon of Paul at Antioch near Pisidia is something like Stephen's speech in the 7th chapter of Acts. That is, he rehearses for the Jewish element of the congregation. He rehearses the history. The people of Israel leaving Egypt, of their wandering 40 years in the wilderness, of their being overseen by judges for a time, and then the three kings, Saul, the first king, and then David and Solomon. And so Paul told them about that, about the 120 years or so that passed while they were ruling over the people of Israel. He talks about the period of the judges. And then he talks about the time that where God had called David a man after his own heart. And so David becomes a type of the Christ that was to come. There is nobody in the Old Testament who has the prominence of David as far as the Christ is concerned. He is an antitype of or Jesus is the antitype, with David being a type of the coming of Christ. And so Paul rehearses for the people of the synagogue something of the period of time when David was king and when Solomon was king. And then he tells them about, it was this David that then became the ancestor of the Christ. John the Baptist came first telling about the Christ, prepared the way for him. And then the coming of the Son of God, who was declared to be the Son of God through the resurrection of the dead. And so Paul begins with Moses, but ends with Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, who was the Son of God. Now, the audience that he was speaking to, some of them were Greeks, and they were sort of proselytes, in some cases actual proselytes, but in other cases sort of loosely attached to the synagogue. And then there were some of the Greeks that I expect went to the synagogue who had no attachment whatsoever. They just went on the Sabbath day because they liked the kind of messages that were heard. And so when Paul stopped preaching, there was a division. Some of the Jews, some of the Gentiles, some of the Greeks that sided with Paul, who put a lot of confidence in what he had to say, and others of the Jews who did not like the sermon. And so a week went by, and Paul and Barnabas showed up a second time at the synagogue. This time it was not as warm and friendly, but they proclaimed to some of the Greeks more about the Christ. And then under pressure from some of the people in Antioch of Pisidia, they had to leave. And so Paul and Barnabas went to Iconium. They preached there while they found the synagogue. And then they went to Lystra, which is south of Iconium. And they preached. These are all cities of Galatia now, of the Roman province of Galatia. And so Paul preached in that city. But in Lystra, you might remember that there was no synagogue. There were just Gentiles there. But Paul healed a man who was lame from his birth. And the people there turned against Paul and tried to stone him. Do you remember that they wanted to call Paul, he was the principal speaker, and so they wanted to call him Hermes. Hermes was the principal speaker among the Greek gods. And they wanted to call Barnabas, since he was the strong, silent one, they wanted to call him Zeus. But in time, the people of the city turned against Paul and Barnabas, took Paul outside the city and stoned him. It's a wonder that he managed to survive. But he was taken back into the city, secretly, no doubt, and there recovered his strength. And then Paul and Barnabas proceeded to go to Derbe. They came back through the cities, appointed elders, it says, in each of the cities, and then returned to Antioch in Syria. But this is the first missionary journey. Acts 13 and 14 is where it's found. The second missionary journey is much longer. Barnabas was only with Paul on the first missionary journey. But it really, we really should think of the beginning of their preaching and their missionary journeys as the bringing of the gospel to the Gentile world. And we'll go on from there next week. Thank you for your attention.